It was a calm Saturday afternoon in Greensboro, North Carolina. The park was alive with activity, children darting between swings, dogs tugging at leashes, and joggers weaving along winding trails. The late summer sun cast a golden hue over the scene, creating a picturesque moment of leisure and harmony. On a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, a man named Malcolm Harris sat quietly, absorbed in a worn paperback. His simple attire, a gray t-shirt and jeans, blended with the casual ambience of the park. But his focused demeanor hinted at a depth that went unnoticed by most passers-by. Malcolm was no ordinary man, though his current appearance exuded peace. His professional life carried a weight of significance. This quiet moment in the park was a rare escape, a chance to reflect and find respite from the intensity of his daily responsibilities. A few yards away, Officer Brian Logan patrolled the park, his gaze scanning the surroundings with practiced vigilance. With 15 years of experience on the force, Brian prided himself on his instincts, often trusting them over reports or protocols. His gaze moved from the playground to the ice cream stand before landing on Malcolm. The sight made him pause. Malcolm's solitary presence and intense focus on his book struck Brian as peculiar. While nothing about Malcolm's appearance or actions was inherently suspicious, Brian's intuition whispered otherwise. A vague description from a recent bulletin about a suspect in a series of burglaries came to mind. A tall black man, approximately 40 years old. It was a generic profile, but Brian's instincts latched onto it. Malcolm felt the officer's stare before he saw it. Glancing up from his book, he locked eyes with Brian. The tension was palpable, even unspoken. Malcolm had been in this situation before, too many times to count. He knew the drill. Any reaction, whether compliance or defiance, could be misconstrued. He chose stillness, his hands resting visibly on his book, while his mind prepared for what he knew was coming. Brian approached with measured steps, his hand hovering near his belt, close enough to his baton to convey authority. "Good afternoon," he said, his tone polite yet edged with formality. "Good afternoon," Malcolm replied evenly, carefully closing his book and placing it on his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes flicking from Malcolm's face to his clothing to the book on his lap, as though trying to piece together a narrative. Malcolm remained calm, just enjoying the day. Brian's expression tightened. He had never seen Malcolm in the park before, and he liked to think he knew the regulars. His unease grew. "You from around here?" he pressed. Malcolm offered a faint smile. "I've been around." Brian's patience began to wane. Malcolm's calm demeanor only heightened his suspicion. "Mind if I see some ID?" Malcolm's smile faded. He knew his rights and that he wasn't obligated to comply without cause. But he also understood the potential consequences of refusing. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his voice measured. Brian's grip tightened on his belt. "You will be if you don't cooperate." A few parkgoers glanced over. Sensing the growing tension, Malcolm sighed, his frustration carefully masked, and retrieved his wallet. Moving deliberately, he handed his ID to Brian, his steady gaze never leaving the officer's face. Brian snatched the ID, scanning it quickly. The name Malcolm Harris revealed nothing incriminating, but his suspicion lingered. "Stand up," he ordered, stepping back to give Malcolm room. Malcolm rose slowly, keeping his hands visible. Brian's instincts, now fueled by pride, urged him to take control. He reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around," Brian commanded. Malcolm hesitated briefly, exhaling deeply before complying. The cuffs clicked into place, their cold metal a stark reminder of the weight of assumptions. Around them, murmurs rippled through the park as onlookers tried to make sense of the scene. Brian guided Malcolm toward his patrol car, ignoring the disapproving stares from the growing crowd. Malcolm remained silent, his composure unwavering despite the injustice. He knew better than to resist. His focus was already on what would come next. At the precinct, Brian led Malcolm inside, his grip firm on Malcolm's arm. Officer Elena Cruz, seated at the front desk, looked up with a puzzled expression. "What's this about?" she asked. "Suspicious activity," Brian muttered, handing over Malcolm's ID. Elena glanced at the ID, her brow furrowing slightly before she masked her reaction. "Captain Davis is in her office," she said, returning the ID. "You'll need to take him to her." Brian hesitated but complied, leading Malcolm down the hallway. Inside Captain Davis's office, the atmosphere shifted. The captain looked up from her desk, her sharp eyes locking onto Malcolm. A flicker of recognition crossed her face before her professional mask returned. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone even. "Caught this guy in the park. He was acting suspicious," Brian said stiffly. Captain Davis's gaze dropped to the ID in her hand. Her expression tightened as she read the name. "Officer Logan," she said, her voice clipped. "Step outside for a moment." Brian blinked, taken aback. "But, Captain—" "Now," she repeated firmly. Reluctantly, Brian exited the office, leaving Malcolm and the captain alone. As the door closed, Captain Davis's demeanor softened. "Mr. Harris," she said quietly, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Malcolm exhaled, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No need, Captain. You're just doing your job." The captain sighed. "I'm aware of who you are, but Officer Logan clearly isn't. We'll handle this appropriately." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "Why didn't you just tell him who you are?" Malcolm's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. "Because it shouldn't matter. My name, my job, none of that should dictate how I'm treated. It's the principle." Captain Davis nodded slowly. "You're right. It shouldn't matter. But for some people, it does." A moment of understanding passed between them before she stood and opened the door. "Officer Logan," she called. Brian re-entered the room, his posture stiff with unease. "Release him," Captain Davis said firmly. Brian hesitated, his confusion evident. "But—" "Immediately," she repeated, with trembling hands. Brian removed the cuffs. Malcolm rubbed his wrists, his calm gaze fixed on Brian. "Thank you, Officer Logan," he said, his tone even but pointed. Brian couldn't meet Malcolm's eyes. The weight of his actions was beginning to sink in, but his pride kept him silent. Malcolm turned to the captain. "I'll be in touch," he said. "There's still a lot to discuss." Captain Davis nodded. "I look forward to it, Mr. Harris." As Malcolm left the office, the tension in the room remained thick. Brian stood motionless, the gravity of his mistake settling over him. He had acted on assumptions, and now the consequences loomed large. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a reckoning, one that would force him to confront truths he had long ignored. For Malcolm, the incident was another reminder of the pervasive challenges he faced, but it also reaffirmed his resolve to fight for change. As he stepped into the warm afternoon sun, he felt the weight of the day begin to lift, replaced by a quiet determination. There was still much work to be done, and Malcolm Harris was ready to see it through.